I began today with an image created in 1984 by the cartoonist at the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Here, graffiti stating Jews out has been written over with graffiti stating asylum seekers out. Two men walk by and say to one another, things have really changed in Germany. The joke, such as it is that nothing has changed in Germany. The eliminationist racism of National Socialism still underlies every encounter. In this talk, I'm going to argue that Germany did change. Aware of the possible reproach of National Socialism, West German officials sought out a self-consciously Western and a self-consciously liberal language for discussing difference. And in so doing, I argue, they developed a more Americanized vision of race and racialization. I'll begin my talk by situating the who, when, and where of the migration movements I discuss in my book, and pointing out some of the ways in which my interpretation differs from that of other scholars. I'll then zero in on two more detailed examples of today's argument about how the American analogy shaped policymaking. I'll first show how the explicit invocation of Harlem as a racialized space shaped urban housing policy for immigrants. And second, I'll examine the way in which a theory of child development was used to justify new restrictions on child migration. Finally, I'll return to this image on the screen to address the larger question of how the legacy of National Socialism haunted discussions of difference in Germany. My book is about the largest non-German migration of people into West Germany in the post-1945 period. So during the 1950s, the West German economy begins to grow at a really rapid pace. And starting in 1955, West Germany signs labor recruitment agreements with Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey, recruiting a total of 2.6 million workers over 18 years. These source countries are largely new for the German lands. Prior to 1945, large-scale labor migration to Germany mostly travels in an east-west direction. People from the Polish lands are coming to the German lands to work as both agricultural and industrial laborers. In this period, that's no longer possible because of the Cold War, because of the Iron Curtain. And so because that's cut off, these traditional kind of sending lands in the east, West Germany is going to turn to the countries bordering the Mediterranean. In trying to realign itself with a civilized world, West Germany draws not just on discourses of East versus West, but also very profoundly on discourses of North versus South. During this period of labor recruitment, 1955 to the mid-70s, guest workers were often described as Southerners, which worked as a homogenizing identity across this group of 6 different countries, from Portugal all the way to Turkey. I like this map because it was created by officials in the Labor Recruitment Office, and I think it does a nice job of showing how this mental map of Europe has been kind of divided into East, West, and South. You will notice that the person who drew this particular map is not resigned to the post-war settlement. Next slide, please. So the popular image of the guest worker program has often been encapsulated in this man on the left. The 1 millionth guest worker, Armando Rodrigues de Sá from Portugal. He was greeted in a ceremony at the Cologne train station in 1964 and given a motorcycle that he was told he could use to ride back to Portugal. Sá, he did it. He does ride back to Portugal, and he is a single man. He is a single and unattached man. He is expected to stay for a short period and then to return. His motorcycle was for a very long time the single artifact that the National History Museum in Bonn used to represent this labor migration, which I think is an interesting comment on the extent to which that migration was for a long time remembered through this trope of mobility, through this trope of impermanence, rather than through the actual fact of long-term settlement for millions of people. In my book, I focus on the fact the guest worker program also always included people like the 2 millionth guest worker, Vera Rimsky of Yugoslavia. She arrives in Germany in 1972, and she does so alongside her husband. Both of the couple were going to work at Siemens in Munich. She's greeted in a ceremony at the Munich train station in 1972, and she's given a television told that it could help her learn German, as well as a promise that officials would find family-suitable housing for the couple soon, that they would move out of the gender-segregated dormitories and into their own apartment. I show you Rimsky because she highlights a really important fact about this migration, which is that it's intimately related to West German family policy. West Germany was wedded to the idea of the male breadwinner and the female housewife, and so it chooses not to invest in policies that would have made it easy for women with children to join the paid workforce. Half-day school was and remains a very widespread model in West Germany, and the state does not invest significantly in childcare until very recent years. It explicitly chooses to look for labor abroad rather than adopting policies that would enable married women to enter the workforce. And employers very aggressively push to recruit foreign women to fill jobs in West German factories, especially in sectors like microelectronics, Siemens, as I mentioned before, textiles, food production, and the hotel and service industries. That proportion only increases over time. By the late 1960s, a woman who came to a recruitment office in Turkey or Spain could be on a train to Germany 1 week later, but a man who came to the same office would find himself on an 18-month waiting list. As a result, many women went ahead of their male spouses and their male siblings, hoping that once they arrived, they could use connections on the ground to facilitate the recruitment of their male family members. Another crucial point is that West Germany does not require any kind of documentation for children who are under 16 until the mid-1990s. So for this entire period, they actually have no way to count or to control the number of foreign children coming into the country. So in this way, this very bedrock principle of West German family policy, West German women belong in the home, comes to entail another family policy: what to do about foreign families. In 1973, this line right here, labor recruitment is abruptly cut off in response to both the end of economic growth and to broader fears of social unrest. But family reunification continues after 1973, and that means the population of people from these countries continues to grow. There are 3 million people from these 6 countries resident in West Germany in 1970 and 4.7 million in 1980, which by that point is 8% of the total population, a not insignificant amount. This is a graph kind of showing how that population develops after the recruitment stop. And one other thing I want to highlight here is that the number of people from the other 5 countries stays fairly constant after 1973, but the Turkish population continues to grow substantially. So a group that didn't really stand out numerically in the 1960s became more and more the group of public attention and the group of public discussion in the 1970s, and especially after. So other historians who have written about this migration have assumed that labor migration came first and was primarily the migration of single men, and that it was followed by family migration, which they have assumed was primarily the migration of dependent women and children. I show this assumption was false. Family migration and labor migration were never separate phenomena, and family migration was not necessarily female migration. Between 1973 and 1980, more men than women enter West Germany under the category family member. Every man who entered as a family member represented a kind of category crisis for the state, which responds by denying all newly arrived family members work permits. The state's decision to define nearly 500,000 adult spouses as non-working family members, and thus to legally reinforce the idea of a single breadwinner, reverberated through migrant families and communities. Many popular depictions of migrants in the late 1970s, including 2 episodes of Tatort, feature a legally working wife and a man who is working illegally. We haven't, I argue, yet taken seriously the extent to which that was state policy. I further argue in the book that this context of family reunion helps us to understand why gender relations have become one of the most important ways in which Europeans index difference between an imagined Europe and its imagined others. We all have heard keywords like headscarves, honor killings, and the patriarchal family. That salience of gender is not an accident, because since the mid-1970s, most foreigners have entered Germany explicitly as family members. So every debate about the migration of an individual has simultaneously been a debate about whether the state has an interest in promoting their family relationships and their family form. This has politicized the meaning of the family and the gender roles within it far beyond what we would expect from cultural differences alone. I also point out in the book that this anxiety about foreign gender roles precedes a specific anxiety about Islam, which I don't find appearing significantly until the 1980s. The first discussion of how male guest workers oppress their wives did not use the category of Islam, but the category of Mediterranean to explain gender dynamics. The idea that Mediterraneans were inevitably patriarchal. This stereotyped migrant family, I argue, was also a key site for the development of neoliberal governance in Germany. One aspect of neoliberalism is state divestment from social reproduction, from healthcare, from childcare, from education, and placing those responsibilities on individuals and their families. This became clear to me when I looked at the landmark 1973 case that broadened family reunion rights for foreigners. In the Spanish grandmother case, an older Spanish woman wanted to live with her daughter, who was a guest worker, and her daughter's children. And the court ruled in her favor on the grounds that she enabled the family to better care for itself. Thank you. As the court explained in its decision, a healthy grandmother is cheaper than a kindergarten. In fact, the court wrote, a healthy grandmother could enable the mother to work overtime, thus allowing the entire family to save up and return to Spain more quickly. This fantasy of a self-contained family, what I call the market-conforming family, following Chancellors Ludwig Erhard and Angela Merkel, proves a very shaky foundation for family unity rights. Only a few years after the Spanish grandmother case, officials came to demonize newly arriving family members both as dangerous sources of foreign values within West Germany, the grandmother might teach the child Spanish, and as burdens on the welfare state, to increasingly focus on the possibility that these grandmothers could be sick, right, could require their own resources rather than simply giving care work for free to the West German state. And so new restrictions on family migration that come in the late 1970s and the 1980s seek to return the family to this imagined ideal of self-sufficiency in two ways. First, they tie access to work permits for family members to their willingness to make themselves more employable by taking more undesirable jobs. And second, they introduce integration tests and income requirements into family migration law, both of which are still centerpieces of European legislation on migration to this day. Migration policy, then, helps us understand something new about the liberalization and westernization of post-war West Germany. And it's this third major historiographic contribution that I want to focus on today. How does a defeated racial dictatorship become a liberal democracy, a booming economic power, and arguably the most powerful country in Europe within 70 years? Historians, including Ulrich Herbert and Konrad Rausch and many others, have really focused on the process of learning liberalism and westernization. But in so doing, they've tended to describe racism and xenophobia as lagging indicators, lingering deficits, as if everything else about West Germany changed, while racism remains this lagging indicator to be gradually abolished by the spread of liberalism. I'll argue today that it's much more useful and it has much more explanatory value if we speak of this learning liberalism also affecting German attitudes towards difference, and with it, German migration policy. Historians like Heidi Fehrenbach and Maria Höhn have studied the US occupation of Germany and have argued that the racial organization of the US military, which was a segregated Jim Crow army at the time, taught West Germans that liberal democracy had its own racial hierarchy. In regulating interracial relationships between white German women and African American GIs, these historians have speculated that West Germans also picked up on American ideas about difference as linked to social environment, psychology, and family relations. I argue that these lessons were extrapolated to other groups, and that West German understandings and misunderstandings of American race relations also came to shape approaches to migration. The bureaucrats, politicians, and activists who compose my archive never, or almost never, use the word race, because that word is so strongly taboo in post-war Germany, but they constantly invoke African Americans and Puerto Ricans as the most appropriate analogies for migrants to West Germany. By bringing this North American example in as a kind of nightmare vision, but failing to theorize racialization as a social process, the West German state repeatedly developed policies that disavowed the existence of social structural phenomena and offloaded responsibility on individuals to solve those problems. My first example comes from what officials called anti-ghettoization policy. Beginning in the early 1970s, when labor recruitment is still going on, officials began to worry about the number of foreigners in Germany. And many use the analogy of Harlem to describe the concentration of foreigners in particular neighborhoods. In this famous 1973 issue of Der Spiegel, whose cover story proclaimed, "The Turks are coming," we read that in Kreuzberg, quote, "Harlem conditions are already visible." The mayor of Munich, Social Democrat Hans-Joachim Vogel, even wrote a 1972 essay titled "Where is Harlem?", in which he wrote, quote, "Naturally the big Harlem is in the United States, but we already have our own little Harlems. Do we want to wait until the big Harlems are also in Germany?" Even debate about whether to show Sesame Street in West Germany seemed obsessed with the show as a product of the ghetto. The director of the Bavarian television station originally decided not to show the program, explaining that it had been developed, quote, "for children in American ghettos, that is to say for children of Puerto Ricans or illiterates." He argued that children would be unable to identify with the blacks on the television screen and refused to show the program in Bavaria. Citing sociological work from the United States, urban planners in both Berlin, West Berlin, and Munich published reports in 1972 where they recommended banning foreigners from living in specific neighborhoods in order to prevent what they called ghettoization in their cities. They described the ghetto as a place with insufficient infrastructure to ensure a decent standard of living, a place where there are not enough parks, schools, hospitals, or livable housing units. At the same time, urban planners dismissed the idea of improving infrastructure by warning that if measures were taken to improve the living conditions in places foreigners already lived, more foreigners might be tempted to move in. For urban planners, then, the key element of the ghetto is not actually underfunded infrastructure. It is a space understood as racially other. I also want to step back for a second to acknowledge that this was very strange to read. West German officials wrote at great length about anti-ghettoization policy and the need to prevent ghettos, but used that language with virtually no reflection on the fact that only 20 to 30 years earlier, a different German state was forcing its Jewish population to live in ghettos. Here, because the ghetto almost always, along with the phrase American conditions and the specific invocation of Harlem, the ghetto appears entirely as an American import. This fear of ghettos manifests itself in multiple bans on foreign settlement into areas that are considered to have too many foreigners. Today I'm going to focus on the ban on foreign movement that was in West Berlin, because that's the ban that lasted the longest. It lasted from January 1st, 1975 to the fall of the Berlin Wall. During that period, foreigners were legally barred from settling in these three districts. That's Wedding, Tiergarten, and Kreuzberg to folks who know Berlin. All of them, at the time this policy went into effect, had over 40% foreign residents, and all of them are directly up against the Berlin Wall. They're very desirable neighborhoods today, but at the time they were, seen as peripheral, seen as kind of on the outskirts of the city. I want you to remember that fact about the Berlin Wall because it becomes important later. So how did this work? Any foreigner during this period who went to apply for or to renew their residence permit at the foreigner's office got a stamp in their passport that looked like this that said, this is not valid for residents in Wedding, Tiergarten, and Kreuzberg. Everyone who lives in Germany is expected to register their address with the local police. So if you have this stamp in your passport and then you try to register your address in such an area, you won't be able to register. And for a foreigner, not being registered was a deportable offense for much of this time. The West Berlin ban included nuclear family members. In several cases, married couples who had lived together in Berlin for several years ran into problems when the husband went to Turkey or Greece to complete his mandatory military service, and found that when he returned, he could not re-register as a resident of the district he was already living in. The ban was also applied against teenagers when they turned 16 and applied for a residence permit for the first time. A 16-year-old girl from Yugoslavia applied to continue living in an apartment with her parents in 1979. Her residence permit was denied. The letter explaining the decision stated that the city was, quote, obliged to discourage an excessive concentration of foreigners in certain neighborhoods in order to prevent the creation of ghettos and sources of social tension. The public interest in this is greater than your private interest in living with your parents. In other words, foreign families were prevented from living together so that they would not be seen as a mass. There was a successful court challenge to this policy exclusively for the nuclear family in 1980, but the larger ban remains in place, and it poses problems for any more expansive definition of the family. It was not possible to move in with an uncle, with an adult sister, or with a same-sex partner who lived in a barred neighborhood. The city insisted that ghettoization was enough of a threat to remove the right of choosing where to live. So what are the consequences of this policy? After the first 5 years of this policy, the percentage of foreigners in Berlin who lived in the 3 barred districts had decreased by 8%, but there had been an increase in the immediately neighboring districts of 7%. Almost all of that population increase occurred in this area, the border of the banned district. That's northern Neukölln and northern Tempelhof. Again, to people who know Berlin, you can kind of see where that would be. And so because it really just shifts the foreign population a little bit to the south, the policy fails. It fails at its stated aim of dissolving concentrations of foreigners and dispersing foreigners across the space of the city. What it succeeds at is creating a new category of illegal residents. Many foreigners who were unable to find an apartment in the rest of the city would decide to live in the banned districts while getting their papers based on false rental contracts elsewhere in the city. They're paying rent under the table and then officially paying for a false rental contract in a place where they don't live. By barring the districts where people could find housing, the ban worked to make a large population of foreigners whose papers were otherwise in order vulnerable to deportation. So very quick note about sources. I got a lot of my information about the market in false rental contracts from the 1980s census boycott movement in West Germany, which was successful in postponing the census from 1983 to 1987. The boycotters had warned that foreigners were canaries in the coal mine for how computerized data could be used against individuals, and one of the things they did was find cases of foreigners who were deported when their true location was discovered. So, next slide, please. In trying to prevent urban ghettos, then, West German officials ended up separating families and creating populations with an increased vulnerability to deportation. That same image of the American inner city also influences another policy debate, this one even more directly related to the larger contestations over family. Next slide, please. When do children age out of the nuclear family? In November 1981, West Berlin announced that it would no longer allow family migration for children over the age of 16. Because under 16-year-olds did not require visas or residence permits, Berlin could not unilaterally further lower the age limit for entry, but it does create a kind of retroactive age limit. Berlin announces that children who have arrived after the age of 13 will be ineligible for further residence permits after reaching the age of 18. These new limits were based on the widespread assumption that teenage migrants were essentially economic migrants using their parents in order to access the labor market, and they unleash mass protests. I found this image initially in a Turkish newspaper, which reported that 10,000 people marched through West Berlin in protest. Members of the left-wing party issued a press release titled, "Are the Turks the Jews of Tomorrow?" and marched in the protest wearing Stars of David that had the words Turk and foreigner on them. I have a picture of those Stars of David in the book. The federal government follows West Berlin with its own set of emergency measures 3 weeks later, lowering the age limit to 16 and warning publicly that it was considering lowering it all the way to 6. The emergency measure of lowering the age limit to 16 has never been lifted, and it is a German peculiarity. No other country in Western Europe lowered the age limit below the age of majority until 2005, when Denmark became the second country to do so. But why 6? Why did it warn that it was considering lowering it to 6? One reason is that it was an age offered by a group of German sociologists who authored a study in 1976 titled The Second Generation. This study theorized that foreign children's prospects for success in Germany could be determined largely on the basis of their age of arrival. The authors based their theory chiefly on the idea of stigma as developed by Berkeley's own Irving Goffman. The authors of the study define stigma as, quote, biological and cultural inheritance. They divided children into 3 groups based on their age of arrival. For children who came after 6, their stigma is manifest, and so their attempts to manage it are destined to fail, forcing them to adopt a social identity as outsider. For children who come between 1 and 5, their ability to become German depends on how well they learn to manage their own stigma. Quote, their adaptation and deception can go so far that inherited biological characteristics like hair and skin color are retouched, as we know for many Negroes in the United States, and the previously acquired ethnic characteristics, language, attitudes, values, etc., are denied or kept latent, end quote. The third category, children born in Germany, might, quote, adapt so far in language and in appearance that their stigma will hardly be recognized. That means, however, that situations in which one can still recognize their otherness, i.e. through their name or contact with their family, will be avoided. The authors warned that many children would struggle to manage their stigma, creating, quote, children who feel themselves to be German but who are not perceived as German. Children who might react in ways that are not dissimilar to those of the Puerto Ricans and Negroes in Manhattan. Next slide, please. So I want to underline here that the authors are taking a very progressive position. Claiming that foreign children born in Germany might feel themselves to be German is a radical statement at a moment when access to citizenship is highly restricted. But the study fails on every page to ask how these children might come to be recognized as German by others. This discomfort with discussing the social process of racialization, the assigning of meaning to bodies based on perceived physical difference, is evident in the way that the physical body and the meanings assigned to it fade in and out of the theory. Stigma is defined as biological and cultural inheritance, but the reader is reassured that the earlier children come, the more their biological characteristics will recede. Children who come before 6 can become German, but it will require that their stigma never be recognized. They have to manage their life such that people do not know their name, do not see their foreign family, and think they are tanned, not dark. Perhaps by using skin lightening creams, like, again, quote, many Negroes and Puerto Ricans in the United States. Becoming German, in other words, requires making your origins invisible. This theory of stigma management is an entirely individualist solution to the social problem of race. the work of integration comes to depend entirely on foreign children's ability to pass. So what does this individualist solution to the social problem of race look like when it begins to be translated into policy? In preparation for expected court challenges, the Interior Ministry draws up a position paper explaining how the age limit of 6 was compatible with Article 6 of the Basic Law. This is Article 6 of the Basic Law of West Germany, a bit like their constitution. It states that marriage and the family shall enjoy the special protection of the state, but it does also specify times that the state might intervene into the family. So children may be separated from their families against the will of their parents, only pursuant to a law, and only if the parents or guardians fail in their duties or the children are otherwise in danger of serious neglect. Proponents of the age limit argue that Article 6 required the state to limit family migration for older children because, on the basis of social science, bringing your child to Germany too late was equivalent to child abuse. According to the Minister for Youth, Family and Health, quote, many foreign parents undoubtedly violate the rights of the children. They should not misuse their parental right by destroying important opportunities for the child and in so doing destroying the child's life. I can quote, and in the book I do quote, dozens of other elites who said similar things, who insisted that because the state did not intend to treat the children as Germans, foreign parents should leave their children at home. By June of 1983, 44% of voters indicated that they agreed with the age limit of 6, 35% were opposed to the age limit of 6, and 20% were undecided. Some of the most creative responses to the proposed ban came from migrants themselves. I interviewed one man who was formerly a leader in the West Berlin Foreigners Committee. I asked him when the group began to protest migration policy, and he told me that I had asked a stupid question. In fact, he said Turkish citizens were just like Germans because the first large-scale political protest he had organized had been quintessentially German. It had been a protest against the Berlin Wall. Specifically, there was a riverbank in Kreuzberg, that's one of the barred districts where a large number of foreigners live, where the river itself was part of East Germany. When people fell into the river, nobody wanted to save them because they feared being shot by East German border guards. 5 children, including 3 children of guest workers, drowned in this river in this way between 1966 and 1975. Chetin Mert drowned in May 1975 on his 5th birthday. His family had been at the river for a picnic to celebrate, and the Turkish community responded with a protest. That protest, in turn, led to East and West Berlin finally coming to an agreement that rescue measures were allowed, and Chetin Mert became the last child to die in that river. In the anti-Berlin Wall protest, these Turkish citizens used a very German term to refer to the wall. They called it the Wall of Shame, or the Schandmauer. And this quintessentially German protest is picked up in later migrant activism. Once I started looking for it, I noticed that Turkish citizens frequently use the idea of the Wall of Shame in order to criticize migration policy. On the left here, I have a political cartoon from a Turkish newspaper, which depicts new visa requirements as a wall of shame. And this is a comic created by the West Berlin Foreigners Committee that depicts the age requirements as a kind of wall between Germany and Turkey. The group also organized protests against the age limit, where protesters chanted, "Decree of shame, wall of shame," drawing an implicit comparison between the wall and the administrative decree. Other scholars have largely not looked at Turkish language press, so they've missed this aspect, but migrants intervened in the debate in a specific language meant to highlight what they understood as West German hypocrisy. They criticized the age ban through a language that was specific to West German concerns and through the potent symbolism of the wall. They used the wall of shame to criticize the fact that the German state seemed to be willing to go to great lengths to reunify families across the Iron Curtain, but not across the Bosphorus. This is particularly ironic because the Berlin Wall was actually the primary source of unauthorized migration into West Germany at this point, which is something I'm very happy to talk about in questions. So the debate on the age limit, will we ban the migration of children after 6, ends entirely because of foreign policy reasons. The foreign minister, Hans Genscher, threatens to resign his post if the age limit of 6 was implemented. He believed that imposing the age limit would worsen the German-Turkish relationship to such a degree that other aspects of their alliance, including NATO itself, would be threatened. But what this means is that the age limit was given up because of tactical foreign policy considerations. It was never publicly repudiated or judged to be wrong or unconstitutional, and this means that it kept coming back. In 2002, the CDU proposed bringing it back in a law which would have kept the age limit of 16 for high-income migrants and imposed an age limit of 6 for low-income migrants. One of the authors of the original second-generation study, Hartmut Griese, writes a book in 1984 in which he apologizes for writing the study, explaining that he had come to believe that the more social scientists did research, quote, the more people should come to believe that foreigners are the source of their own problems. I think Griese should give himself some credit. In the original study, he and his co-authors had recognized how racialization works. They knew that in order to integrate into German society, foreign children would have to pass by changing their names, lightening their skin, and hiding their families. They also consistently chose to make analogies to African Americans and Puerto Ricans in the United States. These are not groups marked by precarious residency status or by the language barrier between Turks and Germans. So why these groups? Both groups are marked in the United States primarily by the categories imposed by the social process of racialization. They're American citizens who are excluded from the full privileges of citizenship because of their racialization as other. Griese and his fellow social scientists understood that race was also a constitutive element of their social world, but they could only admit it through analogy. To use African Americans as an analogy for Turks in Germany was to encode a statement of the unspeakable. The fact that race still persisted after Hitler. There's another way to articulate the unspeakable, and that's through jokes. Turkish Holocaust jokes were their own subgenre in West Germany, and they circulated in a wide range of texts, not just in the radical right, but reprinted in leftist texts and repeated in mainstream media. To offer the least offensive such joke, what is the difference between Turks and Jews? The Jews have it behind them. Many are more visceral. A train leaves Istanbul and arrives in Munich empty. Why? It went through Auschwitz. These jokes need to be treated as a historical source and a subconscious register of attitudes. They appear very suddenly, starting in the early 1980s, and so I think we might understand them as one response to the airing of the Holocaust miniseries on West German television in January 1979. That miniseries is also covered really extensively in the Turkish press, which insists that Turks should watch the miniseries to know what kind of people they were living with. While individuals told these jokes, policymakers and social scientists insisted that there was no link to the past. Their frame of reference for the new German ghetto was never the Jewish ghetto or the Polish neighborhood, but always and insistently Harlem. Why? West German social scientists turned to American social science to avoid the delegitimized biological language of race. State officials picked up their work to justify migration policies that absolved the state of responsibility for solving the problems of foreigners and placed that responsibility back on foreigners themselves. In housing policy, the state restricted foreigners from living together so others would not see them as a mass. In the case of proposed restrictions on child migration, officials had a vision of difference that can only be described as assimilationist. Individuals could become German, but they could do so only as individuals. They had to leave their family behind. Neither policy derives precisely from a National Socialist vision of difference based on elimination of the collective. This is a way of understanding race apparently compatible with liberal democracy and its high value placed on the individual's ability to change. I want to conclude my talk by returning to the disturbing analogy made in the jokes, because that analogy was considered in federal court. West Germany has a law against incitement to racial violence, according to which writing Jews out or drawing a swastika on a wall counts as a criminal incitement to violence. In 1984, the federal court had to rule on whether Turks Out also counted as an incitement to racial violence. The court ruled that it was not because, quote, with the Turks there are not well-known historical experiences that allow the statement to appear as an incitement to violence. This ruling didn't satisfy everyone. Green Party Representative Ingrid Haller objected, quote, the court's reasoning reflects the cynicism of the old joke. What is the difference between Jews and Turks? According to the federal court, completion of a genocide is the prerequisite for punishing public incitement to genocide. This unsettling, inconclusive statement suggests what is at stake in incorporating migration more fully into our understanding of German history. The court recognizes that it is, in fact, historical experience that creates the context within which speech acts have meaning. Writing Jews out on a wall does have a different weight and a different specificity than writing Turks out on a wall. But what does it mean to write Jews out, or what does it mean to write Turks out, or for that matter, asylum seekers out, on a wall where Jews out used to be written? What, for that matter, does it mean to write all of those statements on the same wall, side by side? In this case, what the court wanted to rule out of court was precisely the thing the joke so obviously did: to connect historical moments so that one contextualizes another. West German migration policy was forged within a political culture where the recent past was unspeakable but ever present. This was a relationship of anxious repression, here uncharacteristically revealed in the distanced form of a joke. Within this political culture, it was the North American context, in the form of an imagined Harlem, that came to stand in for the challenges facing West Germany. Just as the joke connected past and present in a way the speaker could disavow as not really serious, the presentation of West German social problems as American social problems suggested that the question of how to live with difference was an import rather than something that had a native history. The stories actors tell themselves about the past matter. The fact that some actors saw the proximate context as Harlem, while others saw it as the Berlin Wall, affected the way that subsequent events unfolded. It's these multiple and nested stories about the German past that continue to shape that past, and the history of migration gives us more possible stories to tell. Thank you.